Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for the next hour. I have the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar entitled Source to Pay in 60 Days, Digitize to Drive Maximum Process Efficiency, presented by our friends at Zycus. My name is John Powell, and I am the VP of Membership Development here at SIG, and I have the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar. These webinars are absolutely meant to be 100% interactive, so please submit your questions throughout the presentation by typing them in the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. We will do our absolute best to answer all the questions at the conclusion of today's presentation. Any that we don't get to, we will forward to our presenters, but please ask them throughout, and we'll get to as many as possible. Before I proceed, I do have just a few housekeeping and calendar items I would like to review with you. So many of you are familiar with SIG, but for those of you maybe joining us for the first time, I'd like to welcome you by quickly covering some of the resources we provide. Our global events program is ever evolving, but it simply wouldn't be possible without our attendees. We would love to have you attend one of our regional events or share them with your colleagues. Please check the SIG website frequently for upcoming cities and current agendas. You are currently participating in our webinar program. That's right now. These take place weekly on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and all are welcome to attend. Visit our website for a complete listing of upcoming webinars, and please feel free to register today. SIG's peer-to-peer resource is an opportunity to ask top-of-mind questions. Please, when you see these, if you have an answer, respond, help out a friend. It puts out good karma, and you'll find that if you help out somebody in the industry, they may help you back when you have a question or something sticking in your crawl. So we also have the Resource Center. It's home to a plethora of tools, templates, white papers, and research documents that will make your job easier each and every day, and who wouldn't want that? SIG's Career Network, we feature job postings for sourcing professionals in internship opportunities in all levels of employment. And last but certainly not least, our Student Talent Outreach Program was designed to find tomorrow's supply chain professionals while students are still learning about the industry and developing their skills. Get them today before they know everything tomorrow, right? I have an 18-year-old son. I know the feeling. Please reach out to me or any of the SIG team members directly. If you have questions or would like more information about any of these programs, please feel free to reach out to us. So we are very excited to announce we have established these strategic partnerships for our SIG members to enjoy. These include full access to the GEP Knowledge Bank, Everest Group, and SIG Innova. Please visit the partnership page for our website under the membership tab for more information. And as always, reach out to me or anyone on the SIG team directly, and we'll be more than happy to talk more about each and every one of these. Global Executive Summits are semi-annual events with more than 350 decision makers in attendance. The agenda is jam-packed with keynote presentations, workshops, breakout sessions, and endless opportunities for networking. The agenda and event details for our Fall Summit in Carlsbad, California are available now on our website, and registration is currently open. Don't miss this one. It's going to be a good one. Here at SIG, we have mixed things up a little bit and refreshed our regional event agendas. Please take a look at some of our upcoming events on the SIG website under the Networking Events tab. If you have colleagues in any of these cities, please invite them to attend. As I mentioned, next up is our Eastern Regional in New York City, the beautiful Harvard Club in downtown New York City. And I will be at the Northeastern Regional in Toronto, Canada. So if you are in those cities or have colleagues or want to make a trip out of it, please feel free. They are free to attend for the buy side if you've never attended before, and they're also a benefit of your SIG membership. SIG University offers training and development opportunities to people of all levels in their sourcing careers. We are currently enrolling for the next semester and for all three of our programs. The next semester will launch on September 30th. If you're interested, please reach out to me directly. Please do not miss our early enrollment discount. You can earn up to 15% off if you enroll up to 4 weeks early. So that brings us to the important part of today, our presentation by our friends here. So it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters. Today we have Richard Waugh, who is the VP of Corporate Development here at Zycus, As the Vice President of Corporate Development, Richard leads strategic initiatives in the areas of new product introduction, market development, thought leadership, analyst relations, and strategic partner development programs. Richard has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce. He helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, TPN, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement. He was also co-founder of B2E Markets, one of the first SaaS sourcing suite providers, and later covered the supply management market as an industry analyst for the Aberdeen Group. Also, we have Morgan Gandy, who is a Director of Global Indirect Procurement at Belden Incorporated. He's coming to us from the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania today, but if you'd like to know more, he is currently serving as the Global Director of Indirect Procurement at Belden Incorporated. Morgan is leading the global digital transformation of indirect procurement at Belden and driving business process improvements and indirect savings across multiple brands on a global basis. Morgan has more than 15 years of experience in procurement, sourcing, supplier relationship management, and category management. Prior to Belden, he has worked at Evoqua Water Technologies, American Eagle Outfitters, Westinghouse Electric Company, and the Goodyear. Richard, we are truly honored to have you both here join us here today, and we're looking forward to what you have to share. So with that, I hand off the mic and the controls to you. Take it away.
Well, thanks so much, John. Pleasure to join you today, and I'm especially pleased to be joined by an expert with the rich diversity of background and experience that you just mentioned for Morgan, who's really going to help us understand the topic for today, source to pay in 60 days. Some of you may recall there was a novel published in the late 1800s by the French writer Jules Verne called Around the World in 80 Days. So at that time, circumnavigating the globe in 80 days was actually moving at a very brisk pace, a very adventurous journey. And, it's part of what we want to convey here. We want to focus on the entire source-to-pay process, but in particular around the efficiency gains that can come from digitizing that process. So actually to complete the source-to-pay cycle in 60 days is the type of superior efficiency that world-class performing organizations are gaining. And we're going to delve into that much more deeply to kind of find some of those key tips and tricks to drive the maximum efficiency gains across the source-to-pay process. So before we get into the agenda, just very briefly, a little bit of context about Zycus. It's a good thing we're talking about source-to-pay because that's what we do at Zycus. We have an integrated suite of modules that cover the expanse of the source-to-pay process, from the upstream stages of more strategic procurement aspects around spend analytics, sourcing, contract and supplier management, to the downstream or operational procurement and procure-to-pay. And we've been recognized as a leader in the space, whether that's by Forrester in their WAVE report looking at P2P, or Gartner's Magic Quadrant for suite vendors, where we've consistently ranked as a leader. So that's a little bit about Zycus, how we come at the topic. The topic for today, source to pay in 60 days, we're going to cover in a few different sort of elements here. We'll start by defining the process and benchmarking the process. What is source to pay? What are the key metrics or key performance indicators to really identify the efficiency and effectiveness that those world-class performers are able to achieve? But then we'll focus primarily on what we'll call a transformation talk. So you've heard of the TED Talk. Today it's going to be a transformation talk where I have a chance to pick Morgan's brain and look at how has the digitization process at Belden, which they've branded as B-Pro, the sort of the internal brand name for their digital platform for procurement, how has that helped them achieve significant efficiency gains and really examine some of the best practices that Morgan's discovered along this transformation path. And we'll close with a look towards the future. What is that next frontier? Because we're always focused on continuous improvement. And one of the key harbingers, if you will, of that next wave of efficiency potential is really embodied in emerging technologies around artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotic process automation that can take some of the most tactical and transactional activities across the procurement process and automate those to further drive a greater and greater efficiency gains and to really free up more of the procurement teams to focus on the most strategic aspects of their job. So that's what we have in mind, a pretty ambitious agenda. So let's get started. And I want to start with a series of KPIs or metrics across the source-to-pay process. That these come from a variety of sources, Hackett Group, Ardent Partners, Aberdeen, Spend Matters included. And they're a mix, I would say, of effectiveness measures, things like what kind of savings are you achieving, what kind of compliance do you have in terms of spend compliant to contract, spend under management, those kinds of things. But we'll focus a little bit more on these efficiency metrics, the ones shown here in the gold color, that comprise that end-to-end source-to-pay cycle time, the 60 days that I referred to. So I want to tee that up for a quick second here, and let's talk about source-to-pay or source-to-cash maybe, and define that process as starting when you initiate a sourcing project. You're going to go to market for a particular category of product or service, and you publish an RFX, request for information, quote, or proposal, go through the negotiation and supplier selection and award process, then put a contract in place to be able to operationalize that agreement. Now, the cycle wouldn't conclude until you've actually onboarded that supplier and sent them a purchase order, received an invoice, and initiated payment. So the reason for defining this as the source-to-cash cycle, the reason for going through a sourcing process is hopefully to identify potential savings in a given category by competitively negotiating that. But the savings don't accrue, they don't turn into actual realized savings until that new agreement is put in place and the first invoice is paid against that newly negotiated agreement. So now you can do that PPV kind of comparison, that purchase price variance that says with the new agreement we're paying 5% less, let's say, than we did on the old agreement, and now it's realized savings because we've actually paid the first supplier invoice against that agreement. So with that as the definition and the backdrop for how do we get to source to pay in 60 days, well, best-in-class organizations are doing that by being able to complete the sourcing cycle more efficiently than the average organization, sort of everyone else. And best-in-class tend to be the top 20% performers. So they're getting through the sourcing cycle in 45 days. They take half as much time in contracting as the average organization, just 11 days, and then they're able to very quickly and efficiently process both purchase orders and invoices. So we'll contrast those 60 days with the average organization that consumes more than 100 days to complete that source-to-cash cycle. So it's not just a nice to know, it's not just completing the cycle time faster. If you've in fact negotiated savings on that new agreement, the net present value of those savings is going to be greater, is going to be realized faster if you can complete that cycle, in this case, for more than 40% more quickly than the average organization overall. So we really want to delve into then each of the steps along the way in source to pay and identify those areas where these best-in-class type organizations have taken advantage of, in particular, digital technologies to shave time off each step in the process and complete it much more efficiently. So with that, Morgan, thanks so much for joining me today on our transformation talk. We've titled it Be Pro is the Way to Go for Digitalization or Digitization at Belden Incorporated. So thanks for joining me, and let's go ahead and get started.
Excellent. Thanks, Richard. Glad to participate in our discussion today.
Yeah, so I hope to bring up the painful past, but I think oftentimes the best place to start is at the beginning, that there's some pain threshold or pain point that is typically the catalyst for driving transformational change like digitization. So I want to start at the beginning. And you know, along the way, I got a number of questions to ask you as the expert, and we kind of have our painometer shown here where, you know, it'd be nice if we were at 0 on the pain meter and we're all happy faces, happy shining faces with no pain, and very few of us want to be at the 9 to 10 with unbearable pain. But wanted to ask you kind of to start at the outset, what were some of the key challenges that you were faced with before you initiated your digital transformation?
Sure, Richard. Glad to talk about that. And John, thanks for the introduction earlier as well. So at Belden, our biggest challenge was limited visibility to spend because we have grown over the last 15 years through multiple acquisitions, and with each of those acquisitions comes their own ERP system. And so working in an environment to where we have multiple ERP systems, data is classified in multiple different ways depending on the ERP system, the country, region, location that you're in. And so lack of visibility to spend was a great challenge, and that was propagated through the IT back end with the multiple ERPs. We do have a data warehouse, but as you know, sometimes pulling data out of that data warehouse is whatever goes in is what you're going to get out, and you don't have an ability, I would say, reclassify that spend, which is some of the benefits you get by doing a digital transformation as we have seen. And so while that data warehouse is there, the data is only good as what went into the ERP system. And so that was a pain point for us as well. And then when we wanted to get spend, because as procurement professionals, like it or not, one of our major objectives on an annual basis is year-over-year savings. Cost avoidance, some locations might call it, but at Belden we focus on the true year-to-year over savings, so price over price kind of savings. And so if that's your objective, not having visibility to the spend really puts us at a disadvantage and put us at a disadvantage. And also, as I look at our process, and this is kind of encompassing maybe your first question, I'm jumping maybe a little bit into your second question as well, is really we were very paper-based. And that might seem strange for an organization in the 21st century, but we had a lot of paper-based processes from creating requisitions. Now, not all of our businesses were that way, but a majority were. And then also for our supplier management. So anytime we wanted to get that spend data or that supplier, there was a piece of paper involved in somebody's manual signature. And so that drove a lot of the pain. And I'd say not only for our users, but really for us as procurement professionals trying to drive continuous improvement and savings throughout the organization.
Excellent, Morgan. And as you looked across your procurement technology landscape, what tools did you have at your disposal? I know you already mentioned a data warehouse, but if you could kind of quickly say what you had on hand available and what you saw as the biggest gaps in your procurement technology infrastructure.
This was the first company that I worked in where I didn't have a procurement system that I was able to go in, take a look at orders. It was ERP company by company by company. So we did not have that global spend visibility yet. We were responsible for that spend and driving savings. And so, it was the data warehouse. It was the multiple ERP systems. And, pulling reports 2 weeks later, you get the report from IT. And while they did their best in pulling the data out of the system, it still was difficult to make sense of it because everything was so manual.
Excellent. And then finally, Morgan, I'll ask you to kind of assess your pain level on the painometer here. We've heard that you had, limited spend visibility, primarily paper-based process, and kind of relying on whatever ERP or, in fact, multiple ERPs could offer you. What would you say the pain level was that sort of initiated or was the impetus for the change?
I would definitely put us in the 7 to 8 range. That hurts a lot. I mean, unbearable pain, were we able to drive savings and do negotiations? Absolutely. Were we effective and efficient at pulling that information? Absolutely not, because we didn't have that spend visibility. And also maybe just to comment on the pain levels, with an organization that's accustomed to a paper-based process, and we'll kind of touch on this maybe a little bit later today, hopefully we get to, sometimes users are fine with the current process, so they're used to it, it's comfortable. And so, from a change management perspective, looking at doing a digital transformation, we had to take that into account. So our pain was not necessarily always the pain of the users that we were engaging with, but at the end of the day, we're driving continuous improvement, and so we recognized the need for change.
Yeah, great point. sometimes it's the fear of the unknown that causes more pain or maybe angst. So, as bad as things may be, you have to be wary of the fact that if you're going to introduce transformational change management is going to have to be part of that approach. I think a great watchword to take into account there. So I want to go through each step in the process. So usually the jumping off point for source to pay is starting with spend visibility and spend analytics. And in fact, I will talk about that in a second. But first, I did want to also kind of get that quick assessment for a little bit of the softer side in terms of how was the procurement organization perceived internally. So here's some data from the Hackett Group that contrasts how respondents said they feel their procurement organization is perceived currently versus where they desire it to be. So, currently, a fair number said they were either at that sort of lofty position of being a valued business partner, 19%, or significantly more were at least considered to be procurement experts by their peers, 33%. But the fact remains that currently across various procurement organizations, they're more likely to be viewed as either a gatekeeper or an administrator as opposed to a valued business partner or an expert. And then we look at the desired state. Most, in fact, aspire to be that valued business partner or at least a procurement expert. I don't really wonder about the 12% here that say we desire to be viewed as the gatekeeper administrator. But and I got ahead of myself on spend analytics there, but before we get into your digital transformation journey, what would you say was the perception of procurement within your enterprise before you started the transformation process?
I would say that varied on who you would ask that question. So at the C-level suite, because of our ability and kind of what we were known for driving savings in the organization, we were viewed or are viewed as business partners or procurement experts in a sense from an executive level, because on an annual basis, targets would be set and we would be able to run negotiations and achieve those savings. But as we continued down that path, we realized we can't continue to go back, in a sense, chew the same food and expect the same results. And so that's where it highlighted the importance of getting visibility to the spend. So at an executive level, they had confidence in our organization. From an end user perspective, maybe somewhat of a gatekeeper, and maybe some would say, oh, you're a barrier because now we have to go through procurement. So it wasn't necessarily, I would say, hey, let's go work with procurement. That probably doesn't vary much from one organization to the next. And so I think that's why when we look at maybe going forward into the future from a digital transformation, it's important to be able to win over those end users. And so from a perception, it varied. We had a great working relationship with our executive team, but from an end user, they don't always see the value. It's just a necessary evil to get their job done. They're focused on timelines and deadlines, not necessarily as much on savings.
Excellent. So a big part of repositioning the procurement brand would be to engage those end users more fully and make sure they're aware of the value that you can bring to win their hearts and minds. So now I want to talk about, you mentioned how critical spend visibility was as sort of a foundational component in your transformation. We've got some data here from Hackett that looks at the fact that world-class performers have better spend visibility, certainly at a supplier level, than the peer group overall. But when you get down to line item visibility, the kind of granular spend analytics that can tell you exactly what you've purchased in what quantities to really formulate negotiating strategies, there the gap between the haves and the have-nots is quite stark. So top performers say they've got nearly 100%, 99% visibility down to the line item level versus just 38% for the average or peer group overall. So I'm curious, kind of before and after, how did you rate your spend visibility before, and what kind of impact did that have on your ability to influence spend, and how have you sort of improved that picture?
Excellent. Good question. So I would say, at the beginning, we had visibility to spend from a supplier level if you really had, I would say, trust in the data. So it didn't give us the line item visibility that we needed to go and take immediate action. Usually we would say, okay, here's a supplier in this business with this amount of spend, and we would see that same supplier appear in other businesses, and therefore that would lead to conversations. So not necessarily immediate action, sourcing, negotiations, which is where we want to spend our time to drive that value. But what we were doing is, okay, let's see where we have some common activity going on across the multiple businesses here at Belden. So now with the tool, what we're able to do is not only see that spend with those suppliers, but now at a line item level. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit further about how do we get good quality data so that that data is more actionable and doesn't require additional follow-up and research and evaluation. So I would say I wouldn't necessarily put us at the top performer as the 99% because you still have those users and there's that follow-on education. Hey, we don't want to put requests in based on just a summary or a lot. We want to get the itemized detail. And the nice thing about the Zycus tool is it gives us the ability to make it easier for those end users to load that line item data detail in a way that we can work with it going forward into the future and spend analytics and further data evaluation. But we had the challenges, and that's really what drove our need to go down the path of a digital transformation, better spend visibility being key.
Perfect. And of course, that spend visibility then can give you some insights into where are the opportunities for savings, and that sort of segues then into the sourcing cycle. So if spend visibility can help me prioritize the sourcing projects that I want to work on, certainly I'm going to want to be able to complete that sourcing process as efficiently as possible. So here again, I got a lot of data that Hackett's provided for us that actually shows broad variability in the sourcing phase. And of course, the most tactical sort of 3 bids and a buy type events can be completed very quickly. So you see the minimum, the average, and the maximum. So that spread is somewhere between 1 to 10 days. But very, very highly complex, more typically RFP-driven processes can range from 30 to 120 days overall. And Hackett's also broken down for us kind of within the sourcing process. Most of the time is actually consumed in the evaluation and negotiation stages. Things that digitization, by being able to capture bids electronically and optimize award decisions using the analytics, can certainly compress that cycle and perhaps reallocate more of that time. It might be better to spend more than 13% of the time developing the strategy or 16% profiling the category. But interested in your perspectives on the sourcing process. How did you look at your cycle times as compared to some of the benchmarks, and sort of where did you want to be spending more of your time in the sourcing process, and how can the tools help you to be more strategic in sourcing?
Absolutely. So I would say at the very beginning, we really look at it in two fronts from a sourcing perspective. One is the tactical buys. In the past, because we were so paper-based, I mean, the tactical buys was very manual. What we're seeing now, and how do we compare benchmark-wise, is we're down to the 1 to 2 days as far as on those tactical 3 bids and a buy. The data is coming in an executable format, and we're able to quickly solicit requests from suppliers and then execute on those purchases. For the more strategic buys, with the cycle times in sourcing through leveraging the iAnalyze data as well as the actual live spend data that we're able to see through our procurement process in the e-procurement tools, we have good information going in, so we're able now to spend more time in the let's develop the strategy, let's analyze the spend in advance, because we now have it in a good user-friendly format, and focus more of our times there, as well as negotiations. And we spend some time as well having those discussions with suppliers, and in a sense what we call supplier conditioning, to where we can show them better visibility because we now have better visibility to our needs, and focus more on the negotiation phase and the strategy development, which is driving our value through the new sourcing process.
Interesting. It sounds like you view that supplier negotiation as more of a fact-based collaboration and not the zero-sum game that a more adversarial approach can imply in that negotiating process. So I think kind of an evolved approach there. So certainly some efficiencies that can be gained in the sourcing process. I wanted to segue then to, okay, you've completed the RFX, you've awarded the business to this, best value supplier or suppliers in that event, but now you need to still put a contractual agreement in place. So here, this is some data from the Aberdeen Group that looks at just that contracting cycle and the cycle time to create a contract, go through the negotiation around T's and C's. You've already negotiated price in the sourcing phase, but then to get signature on those contracts, either wet signature or digital signatures in the modern idiom here, and that's 21, 22 days on average, whereas best in class have cut that cycle time in half. So I wanted to get your perspective on, again, a little bit of the before and after. How did the contracting cycle times compare? What did you see as the choke points in the process, and how can digitization help improve the efficiency in contracting?
Excellent. So I would say where our area of focus is in here, and I would put us, we started definitely toward the bottom and we're moving toward the best in class. We're not there yet. We've actually been going down this digital transformation almost 2 years now, but from a procure to order perspective, really over the last 15 months. So we've come a long way. We still have a ways to go, but we're definitely moving in the direction of the best in class. Our focus really at this point, Richard's been on the total spend under management. So now we have contracts into the contracts module. Being able to push those contracts over to our procurement module is giving us some advantages. It's allowing us to make sure we're staying on top of contracts that otherwise maybe they would have expired or renewed. Now we have that visibility because of the alert capabilities within the technology, within the Zycus technology. And then we're also able to drive contract compliance. The last thing we want to do as procurement professionals is negotiate an agreement and then never have that pricing executed by our end users. So with the ability of loading the contracts and the line items associated with that, pushing that over into our procurement module, so now we have catalogs and for our end users to be able to seamlessly buy off of. Not only is it improving their experiences, which is kind of a focus of ours, especially now going down the digital transformation path, but making sure that they have a good user experience, and then we want to make sure that what that negotiation achieved is going to be realized on the back end. And that's our expectation from our executives as well. So it's not just, well, this is just a procurement tool. This is really a Belden tool, and why we really wanted to brand this as a B-Pro system.
Terrific, yeah. So some efficiencies that you've seen to date, but maybe a little bit more focus around those effectiveness measures in the contracting cycle, either in terms of having, just more spend on contract or greater compliance to those contracts. Certainly critical key performance indicators in that phase as well. So did want to move then from contracting into procure to pay, and you mentioned there's a natural linkage there. Having your contracts available and visible at the point of requisition and procure to pay is going to be a key towards driving spend compliance. So we want to really examine all aspects of procure to pay, and we'll start with the transaction processing cycle time, so those efficiency metrics again. So here, the Hackett benchmark data contrast PO and invoice processing across a couple of dimensions. Sort of the cleanest transaction would start with a catalog-based purchase, because that's the quickest and fastest way to complete an order, and then kind of almost by definition that catalog-based order is on PO. A PO-backed invoice is going to be easier to get approved, and because you're going through the matching of the invoice lines to the PO lines and so on. Contrasted with more of the ad hoc purchases that take maybe twice as long and or 3 times as long and consume more time on the back end when you have more of the non-PO invoices that show up. So there's some variability here, but essentially the best-in-class organizations can complete a catalog purchase in less than 2 hours. And the invoice that comes around when it's a PO-backed invoice, they can be matched and approved for payment in just 3 days. Now, that doesn't mean payment's going to be released, but they're approved within 3 days, and being able to complete that process so efficiently, of course, would have downstream benefits. Would be key to maximizing early pay discounts, for example, if you had standard terms like a 2% discount for payment in 10 days. Well, if you complete that cycle more quickly than that, just 3 days in this case, you have the opportunity to maximize those discounts. So important implications of being able to complete these processes in a very timely manner, and probably not the least of which is end user satisfaction, because they don't like to sit around waiting for their requisitions and orders to be processed so that they can get the product or service that they need. So when we look at transaction processing cycle times, how would you say your experience compared at Belden to some of these benchmarks, and what were some of the choke points in your process before you deployed the P2P solution?
So from choke points and steps in the process, going from a very paper-based process across all of our sites, most of our sites, to now going from a digital process where we're taking advantage of not only catalog purchases, punch-outs directly to supplier websites. What we've been able to do is quite unique, and I would say we're actually better than the 2-hour cycle from a catalog purchase perspective. So what we're able to do today, and kind of how we implemented this path and have gone down this path, is we basically took our approval process that existed in the paper world and understandably implemented that within the tool. And so, but we did make a few changes. So we're always about continuous improvement. One of the changes we made is if we're going to set up a catalog, why does it have to go back to procurement for approval? The Zycus tool allowed us to bypass that step if it's a catalog-based purchase. So that not only improved our cycle times, but it improved our end user experience. And so we already approved those suppliers. We approved those contracts. So catalog-based purchases do not have to come back through procurement for any special approval. So that's why we're better than a 2-hour cycle time. It goes out for a business unit approval. One of the things we've noticed, though, talk about continuous improvement and really eliminating choke points and pain points in the process and reducing cycle times, is we've been able to now look at that data and the digital data that's now coming out of our Zycus system and BPro, and being able to say, does it make sense to have all these approvals that existed in the paper world now in this digital world? And so our leadership from executives within the finance organization have said, you know what, we can trust the organization. We have controls in place with these catalog purchases. We know what's being bought, and we have visibility to the spend. And so we're now able to streamline that approval process, which is then further enhancing our cycle improvement times. From an ad hoc purchases perspective, we're seeing reductions in the time there because we're now pushing that requisition create from what used to be, let me write it on a piece of paper, hand that paper off to somebody to then go manually retype and enter into a system, an ERP system, to doing that up front, and then it's a digital process. No more walking approvals around from one site to the next. Those approvals are happening like we are in the 21st century directly on a mobile phone. And so the email comes in, the notification comes in, the manager is able to approve electronically, really streamline the process. And so now that we have good, consistent data that's being pushed over onto the AP side, we're driving improvements there on the payment end because the data is in a controlled setup all the way back on the procurement end through our PO cycling process. It's a great experience.
Yeah, really interesting too, Morgan. It sounds like one of the best practices that you discovered is with the digital transformation, don't necessarily just, transfer over your existing process. It may no longer make sense in the digital world. So kind of forcing that reexamination of what's really necessary could be an indirect benefit of the introducing the technology change as well.
Absolutely.
So continuing on this kind of process flow, certainly one of the key enablers to getting that efficiency and cycle time compression is taking what in your case, as you mentioned, had heretofore been almost exclusively paper-based and digitizing the transactions themselves. So if we follow the transaction flow from requisition to PO change or release against blanket orders through invoice receipt and payment, here we've got some benchmark data that, again, contrasts what are top performers achieving in terms of the level of digitization for those transactions versus the peer group overall. I think when you start with requisitions, 100% for top performers, but still a very high percentage on average. Most folks have some type of electronic requisitioning front end, but it drops off significantly from there. So whereas the top performers are actually delivering electronically 85% of the purchase orders, meaning using a portal technology or a standard protocol like EDI or CXML, the average is way down at just about a third of the transactions delivered electronically. And there's sort of a ripple effect. Being able to deliver the vast majority of POs electronically, 85% top performers, really is the enabler to getting an electronic invoice back. It enables, what we'll call the PO flip, taking that electronic PO on the supplier side and flipping it into an electronic invoice back to the buying organization. So there you got almost the same number, 79%, pretty high penetration of electronic invoices, and we mean truly electronic invoices, those delivered via CXML, EDI, or through a portal, not just an email with an attached invoice file that doesn't qualify. And because it still requires an offline process. Someone has to open that attachment and key it in or scan it in or something. So again, very low penetration at the peer group level for e-invoicing, just 28%. So it kind of says that not only is a key enabler here digitizing the transactions themselves, but starting at the front end by being able to turn an electronic requisition into electronic PO is the enabler for the downstream transactions as well, like invoice receipt and ultimately payment. So I wanted to get into a little bit more, and you mentioned it a little bit, Morgan, how critical the e-catalogs are in driving efficiency in the P2P process. So again, a lot of benchmark data, kind of interesting to me that even top performers are getting a fairly small percentage of total indirect spend, just 15%, through catalogs. So we're talking about things like office supplies or IT and maybe some MRO. So a relatively low percentage of the total spend, where much more of the spend might be services, for example, but pretty high percentages in terms of the efficiencies that could be gained. So 49% of orders for top performers are catalog-based transactions, and an even higher percentage, 63%, if you look at the line items. That's really what's measured here when you compare catalog versus free text. That's the number of line items, 63% in that case. So I wanted you to comment on your experience with catalog buying, how it compares to these benchmarks, and I know you referred to it, but maybe if you could talk a little bit more specifically about how critical catalog buying is towards driving that sort of user satisfaction, a better user experience. And users may, after all, be familiar in their personal lives with buying online from Amazon, for example. How do you emulate that experience?
Yeah, it's been really nice to be able to take what users are accustomed to in their personal life and bringing that into the business world here at Belden. So one of the things, and I think it was an earlier question, what worked well? What have you done that has worked well to drive the success with BPro? And I would say when we're going out to a new site that we haven't implemented BPro at before, we'll spend time with those sites and talk about their current process, but talk about the to-be. And we really stress the importance of what are your repeat buys, who are you buying from, what are those items, what's that pricing, and being able to take those repetitive buys and putting that information into a catalog. Now, we might not have immediately negotiated that spend and compared that against all of our other transactions that are going on of similar nature, but that's going to happen relatively quick once we get them live on the tool. But we want to drive user adoption, because if we're not getting that spend and activity going through the tool, and we have folks that are looking to work outside the process, then we're failing. And so one of the things we focused on is having direct discussions with those users about what it is that you buy on a regular basis. Now, we'll have, when we go live day one, we'll have all the punch outs from your IT supplies to your office supplies to your MRO needs to some of your marketing items, promotional purchases. That's there day one, and that really drives user satisfaction, but also to make it more personable at each of the sites we implement the technology at. We have those direct conversations. What can we do to make your life better, to drive a better user experience, so you're not spending time on those ad hoc buys? No one really gets value out of typing. And so, but by driving them toward catalogs and working with those sites before we bring them on the tool, to focus in on giving us their catalog information and building those catalogs, so day one they can start taking advantage of that capability within the Zycus platform. We're driving user adoption. We're increasing our number of transactions. We're not at the top performer group just because our spend is so diverse, but we're well above the peer group. And so it just, as we talked about earlier, how do we make it a good experience, not only and give the results that the executives want to see, but also drive that user adoption, drive that buying experience? We're able to do that specifically taking advantage of the catalog functionality and technology. It's great.
Great success story. So we've talked a lot about the cost of transactions or the cycle time to complete a transaction. I wanted to just share a few more data points here around transaction quality. So looking across the entire flow, starting with the requisition through payment, the benchmark is an 80% perfect order rate, meaning 0 defects across that entire cycle. But you can look at individual steps along the way. 98% PO completion compliance rate just means that on average 2% of POs are submitted after the fact, after the invoice has already been received. So that's kind of by definition a fail in 2% of the cases. But you could look at on-time delivery. Is the invoice accepted? It's submitted accurately. Does it match on the first pass to the PO 83% of the time, so on and so forth. So I wanted to go through these pretty quickly, but just some other ways to sort of look at efficiency and really in terms of the transaction quality. Of course, none of this happens in the P2P environment where you're exchanging POs and invoices with suppliers unless you're effective at onboarding suppliers and managing suppliers. So here we can look at supplier management in terms of how effective have you been in sort of rationalizing and consolidating the supply base. So right off the bat, top performers have a much easier time because they're managing relatively fewer suppliers per billion of spend. About 6,800 versus almost 18,000 for the peer group overall. Plus, they've got more of a spend concentration within that supply base. So top performers are capturing 80% of invoice volume from just 4% of the active suppliers. So that's really critical when you go to onboard the suppliers, because you can capture the lion's share of your spend through onboarding. In fact, a small percentage of your highest transaction volume suppliers. And here's some data that looks at what does it cost per supplier to onboard them, that it takes on average 16 days of elapsed time and 17 hours of applied time to onboard. So not to be overlooked, the supplier onboarding as we go through the process. So as we wrap up our discussion of P2P here, Morgan, I just kind of brought back sort of a summary scorecard of all these key metrics across procure to pay and asked for sort of a summary view from your standpoint. As you looked at your P2P enablement, how have you been able to impact cycle times? To what extent have you digitized the transactions, and has it resulted in improvements in transaction process cost, quality, or both?
I would like to just maybe highlight 3 areas where I think we've had the greatest impact. obviously we've improved in each of these areas, but electronic purchase orders, going from paper-based to electronic, we'll be over 85% because all of our indirect spend we're pushing, except for those taxes and some of the governmental types of payments, but rents, utilities, anything that's really indirect spend outside of the few that I mentioned are going on to electronic purchase orders. And so that's a huge transition for our business, a time savings, and the fact that the technology is user-friendly, we're having high user adoption, we're not going to have an issue with maintaining the electronic purchase orders because we're driving that user adoption. Electronic payments is another one I want to mention. Through the supplier onboarding process, we're going from check payments to electronic payments and onboarding those suppliers. Those suppliers are now able to make sure that their information that we have, I guess our view of them, is up to date and current because we now have a portal to collaborate with, and they can make sure that their information from a payment perspective is up to date current, and we're driving electronic payments. We're over 81%. We're sitting at 85%, and our target's to go to 90% this year. From a PO processing and cycle time, that is absolutely a benefit to us because as our buyers in the past would have all these stacks of papers piling up on their desk, now that information is coming to them electronically, and we're significantly reducing the cycle time for orders. And so once that order is fully approved, we're less than an hour of that order sitting with the buyer, taking a review on it before they transmit it over to the supplier via PO. Now, for the catalog buys, which we talked about earlier, those don't even go to a buyer anymore within our organization because we've already done those negotiations. We're driving that contract compliance. We have control of that spend. In a sense, with our catalogs and our punch-outs, it's the freedom for them to buy without the choice because that's the suppliers they want to buy from. And so that's a huge win for us in helping us drive greatly improved cycle times.
Awesome. Now, before we close the books on P2P, you don't start to actually accrue any of these tremendous benefits until you get through the implementation cycle. So just a word on P2P implementations here. This is from Gartner. That looks at sort of a range of cycle time for P2P implementations, but the mean, the average, is just below 8 months. So, and that would be the initial implementation with P2P. Usually there are sort of multiple phases of the rollout, but from a standstill to go live, just under 8 months. What was your experience, and what best practices or strategies did you discover throughout your P2P implementation process?
Sure. So as I mentioned, we have multiple ERPs, and so our initial implementation of the technology, we did a phased approach. We looked at locations. From a prioritization, we looked at locations with the largest spend because we wanted the quickest visibility to our data. But our initial implementation took 5 months. So that's from the very beginning. You work on the master data, you work on the integration activities, you work with the sites, you have those demos, those as-is discussions, those to-be discussions, the training, the data conversion, and then going live on the tool and having them transact their business through the Zycus platform, which we branded B-Pro. So our initial implementation took 5 months, but now going forward, we're getting ready to do our 8th implementation. And again, our focus this year has really been on, I would say, over the past year has been on North America, both Canada, U.S., and Mexico. Now we're going into Europe. We have one site live on the tool in Europe, but that's kind of the direction that we're going. And to go to that next site now, we're talking 3 months. And so that's a lot of focused discussions with end users, but a quick deployment of the technology.
Terrific. I want to jump ahead just real quickly to kind of talk a little bit about the business case for digital transformation. So here you've got a lot of reasons for justifying an investment in digital technology, and of course, business value, operating costs, kind of those financial metrics are always going to be important. 43% of the top performers talk about business value, 29% operating costs. But it's interesting to me, even larger percentages are focused on some of the softer benefits: customer satisfaction, business agility, quality of service. So I'm curious, in the case of Belden, what were the key value drivers for your business case, and how did you go about selecting a technology solution?
So a couple things there, Richard. So the key driver for us, and the reason we went down this path, because from an executive sponsorship, was really about savings. We wanted the savings. We knew the savings was out there, but lack of visibility of the spend. So that was one of our key drivers. From an evaluation of the technology, we had to focus on ease of use and ability to deploy the technology and capabilities within the tool to further eliminate steps. Yeah, you're going from paper to electronic, but what within that tool allows us to make a very streamlined approach, and what capabilities, like the capabilities that exist within the Zycus platform, allow us to make it more of a touchless process. And so we're able to streamline the electronic process. We're able to definitely streamline the overall process by taking from a paper process to a digital process, because the tool is so easy to use. And so those were our key areas of focus and the drivers behind our decision.
Oh, terrific. And I do want to just fast forward here for a second, because I promised we'd get to the next frontier. What comes next after you've digitized the core processes, and in particular, how can AI and emerging technologies like machine learning, RPA, drive this future of autonomous procurement? This kind of looks at the evolution of these technologies. So back in the dark ages, there were simply macros that people developed to perform the routine, repetitive tasks that they didn't want to do on a constant basis. And sort of RPA, robotic process automation, a rules-based technology, let's say that's macros on steroids, a way to scale these processes, these autonomous processes on an enterprise-wide basis. But as the technologies continue to evolve and emerge, we get to those higher levels of systems that learn, based on machine learning and artificial intelligence. And here's some data from Medium.com that looks across the P2P process and says, for instance, you might be able to take 40% out of the time in submitting and approving purchase requests just by introducing bots, if you will, either AI or RPA bots, to drive these processes. So some interesting potential gains in those areas, and but adoption has been fairly slow. We actually did a study in concert with ISM that we presented at ISM's conference earlier this year that said just 22% are currently using AI and RPA, and most for less than a year. So lots of room for growth in this area, and lots of opportunities to target discrete process steps, especially those that are most transactional and tactical, such as the P2P process, processing requisitions, POs, and invoices, for example. And those are some of the things we're focused on at Zycus, what we call the Merlin AI Studio. So these are bots designed to leverage AI, machine learning, and RPA to automate those most tactical processes. And here, just to sum up, is some of the examples of those bots, an invoice email attachment bot to actually read those attached files to create an electronic invoice without human intervention being required, or a buyer's desk bot to sort of adjudicate requisitions without a buyer having to spend time on those low-value tactical purchases. So, no, we just have a couple minutes left, but Morgan, your thoughts about the potential for AI and RPA as we go forward in the future?
I would call it digital transformation too, because we've gone a long way, but I look forward to the technology, especially when it comes to giving us recommendations on savings and sourcing opportunities. The tool sees it. The tool can be able to recommend those things to us, and really just helping us further streamline our overall process. A lot of advancements I'm looking forward to seeing as we move to the future of AI.
Awesome. And John, more discussion perhaps for another day, but just wanted to tee up that next frontier, where we're going and how we can get even more efficient, maybe get it from source to pay in 60 days, why not source to pay in 40 days or 30 days, and so on and so forth. But let me turn it back to you.
Well, thank you, Richard. And I do want to thank our presenters today, Richard and Morgan. It was a fantastic job. We conversation could have went on for another 15, 30 minutes easily. Great content, and I certainly want to thank you. So everyone that listened in, you'll notice that you're seeing a file transfer pop up. The presenters are sharing their slides from today. So this does conclude today's webinar. As I mentioned, I do want to thank our presenters. We look forward to connecting with you guys again soon. We have pushed out the slides. Just click on that link in your WebEx screen. You can download it straight from your desktop. Also keep an eye out for a follow-up email you will receive tomorrow, which also will include a PDF of these slides. Feel free to share this with your colleagues or anyone you think would benefit from this content. Again, thank you all for joining. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all very much. Thank you.